On May 22nd, the Trump administration announced a major decision to revoke Harvard University's Student and Exchange Visitor Program (SEVP) certification, banning the university from enrolling international students and ordering approximately 6,800 current foreign students to transfer to other institutions within 72 hours or lose their legal study status in the U.S. spearheaded by the Department of Homeland Security. Secretary Kristi Noem justified the move as necessary to protect national security, combat anti-American and anti-Semitic activities on campus, and address escalating extremism in top universities. However, U.S. District Judge Jeffrey White of California issued an injunction the same day, blocking the administration from terminating the legal status of international students at Harvard and other universities during litigation. The order also prohibits the Trump administration from arresting or detaining students based on immigration status while the case is under review. Why has the Trump administration taken such drastic action against America's most influential university? The story begins in January 2025, when the administration launched a high-profile, systematic review of top U.S. colleges under the pretext of combating campus anti-Semitism. The political storm originated from pro-Palestinian protests on campuses amid the Israel-Hamas conflict. But what started as a seemingly routine review has evolved into the most intense confrontation between academic freedom and executive power in U.S. history, and Harvard now finds itself at the center of the maelstrom. From January to March 2025, the Trump administration used anti-Semitism as a wedge to impose a series of harsh demands on Harvard and other universities, reforming admissions policies, shutting down diversity programs, and tightening scrutiny of international students. This was no mere policy adjustment. Beneath it lay a deeper agenda to reshape university ideology by controlling federal funding, essentially aiming to turn colleges into ideological strongholds for conservative views. Harvard refused to back down. President Alan Garber stated bluntly in an open letter that no government would interfere with a private university's curriculum, admissions, or research direction, directly challenging the Trump administration. In April, tensions escalated into fiscal coercion and legal battles. On April 11th, the administration issued a final ultimatum: Harvard must undergo governance reforms or face federal funding cuts. Federal funding is critical to universities, but Harvard refused on April 14th. The administration immediately froze $2.2 billion in multi-year grants and $60 million in active contracts, an economic blow intended to force compliance. Undeterred, Harvard sued the federal government on April 21st, arguing that fiscal coercion to interfere with academic freedom violated the First Amendment. The conflict shifted into the public legal arena, framing it as a battle for constitutional principles. By May, the situation grew more intense. On May 22nd, DHS revoked Harvard's SEP certification, citing systemic violations, effectively barring international enrollments for the 2025 to 2026 academic year and threatening deportation for 27% of Harvard's student body, 6,800 international students. International students contribute $384 million annually in tuition and support 3,900 jobs, making the move a severe financial and operational blow. Noem explicitly called it a warning to universities nationwide, aiming to intimidate others into submission. The motivations behind targeting Harvard are multi-layered. Ideologically, it represents an academic purge. Ivy League institutions, particularly Harvard, are strongholds of liberalism, and the Trump administration seeks to transform universities into platforms for conservative ideology. With a $53.2 billion endowment and global alumni network, controlling Harvard would amplify conservative influence. Demanding an end to day programs and banning radical leftist faculty hires are tactics to reshape campus discourse into a single ideological voice. Politically, it aligns with Trump's 2024 campaign narrative of anti-elitism. On the one hand, suppressing elite institutions like Harvard caters to the hostility of core voters towards the establishment. Ordinary people will feel relieved when they see the government rectifying the high-ranking elite universities. On the other hand, it is also a means to divert public opinion from the failure of economic policies and shift public attention away from problems such as high inflation and stagnant wages. As the legal battle unfolds, The stakes are historic, a test of whether universities can retain autonomy as bastions of free thought or whether executive power will gain unprecedented control over academic life. Judge White's injunction temporarily preserves international student status, but the case will ultimately hinge on whether the courts view DHS's actions as lawful governance or unconstitutional retaliation, a decision with far-reaching implications for higher education and civil liberties across the US. The Trump administration's portrayal of international students' privileges as harmful to US interests is nothing but a smokescreen to divert domestic public dissatisfaction with economic issues. Looking at the conflict between fiscal hegemony and academic independence, while Harvard's endowment is substantial, accounting for 89% of its revenue, federal funding remains critical for research in key fields. By freezing $2.2 billion in grants, the government aims to sever Harvard's academic lifeline and force submission, a sledgehammer blow to the university's core that exposes the structural vulnerability of America's higher education system to funding dependencies. From a global talent competition perspective, the Trump administration's actions are self-destructive. International students are the core of America's technological competitiveness. At Harvard, Chinese students account for 20% of international enrollment, joined by vast talent from India, South Korea, and other emerging economies. Such xenophobic policies will only accelerate this brain drain to Europe and Asia. Nobel laureate Lawrence Summers has warned this is self-annihilation of US hegemony. America has long relied on attracting global talent for technological advancement, and discarding this advantage is folly. The conflict also raises legal and institutional risks. For example, the government revoked SEVP certification without following the Administrative Procedure Act's required hearing process, a clear procedural violation. Harvard's lawyers argue Secretary Noem's decision lacks concrete evidence and constitutes arbitrary executive overreach. Legal experts predict the courts may overturn the decision on grounds of overstepping authority. At the core of Harvard's lawsuit is the government's attempt to control academic decisions through fiscal coercion, a direct violation of constitutionally protected academic freedom. A government victory would set a dangerous precedent for future fiscal intimidation of academia, shaking the foundations of US higher education independence. Institutional crises in higher education are evident in the contrast between Columbia University, which compromised, accepted the government's anti-Semitism standards, leading to research contractions and faculty departures, and Harvard, which resisted, triggering global talent drain. These divergent choices signal a potential split in US higher education between compliant and resistant camps, boding ill for its future. Internationally, the Harvard incident marks a symbolic decline in America's global soft power. Once admired for open universities, the US now faces 1,300 plus Chinese students, 20% of Harvard's international cohort considering transfers, accelerating the rise of Asian educational hubs. The EU has launched a global talent initiative, streamlining visa processes for top scholars, a direct challenge to America's talent monopoly. The incident also alerted the world of authoritarian politics infiltrating academia via national security justifications, fiscal control, and identity politics, a dangerous model now emulated elsewhere, threatening global academic independence. Domestically, the Harvard-Trump confrontation embodies a civil war over America's founding spirit, Harvard upholding intellectual freedom versus an administration promoting executive supremacy. This divide has grown since the 2020 election, risking national fragmentation. In legal terms, Harvard has a high probability of winning, though the process will be lengthy. A loss would legitimize federal fiscal control over universities, collapsing academic freedom. A victory could establish a landmark precedent against government intervention via funding. This conflict will accelerate the defederalization of US universities. Wealthy private institutions like MIT and Stanford may follow Harvard in resisting federal funds, while public universities dependent on federal support may have to concede, deepening educational polarization. Globally, US share of international students is projected to fall from 6% to 3% by 2030, with Germany, Singapore, and Canada absorbing outflow talent. China, with its double first-class universities investing 480 billion yuan in research by 2024, stands to benefit most. In the end, Trump's policies represent the pinnacle of anti-intellectualism. By dismantling the higher education system that attracts global elites, he is personally burying America's technological lead. As historians note, without freedom of thought, hegemony becomes a house of cards. Continued down this path will hasten US decline.